The grand chamber of the Varisian Concord had stood for 11,000 years without ever being silent. Now it was silent. Ambassador Threlkos of the Drenic Compact stood frozen at the podium, his 4 eyes locked on the tactical display hovering above the chamber floor. Across from him, General Vavres of the Ilkani Dominion, a being who had commanded fleets for 3 centuries, who had watched entire star systems burn under his orders, had gone the color of old ash. Both of their war rooms had gone dark at exactly 0300 hours, Concord Standard Time. Not destroyed. Not hacked. Silenced. Every warship in both battle fleets, 6,000 vessels combined, armed with enough firepower to crack planets like eggs, had gone completely dead in space. No weapons. No engines. No shields. Just drifting. Lights on. Life support running. Crews alive and screaming into comm channels that led nowhere. And on every single bridge, on every single screen, in every language spoken by either empire, the same message had appeared at the same moment. Good morning. We'd like to talk about your war. It was signed by a species neither empire had bothered to remember the name of. The humans. The primitives. The one race in the entire Concord roster that both empires had unanimously agreed, 6 months earlier, was too weak, too young, and too harmless to be worth including in any serious negotiation. Threlkos finally found his voice. It came out as a whisper. How? Not a question. A prayer. Because 40 light-years away, on a world that didn't even have a seat on the Concord Council, a species that had been flying starships for less than 80 years had just done something no one in the galaxy had managed in 11 centuries. They had ended the Drenico-Kani War. In one night. Without firing a single shot. To understand how, you have to go back to the day humanity was formally introduced to galactic society, and formally dismissed by it. The Concord Council chamber on neutral station of Eth-9 was packed the day Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked in, representing the newly contacted planet Earth. She was 51 years old, spoke 6 languages, and had spent 30 years as a hostage negotiator for the United Nations before the Concord's arrival made interstellar diplomat a job description that suddenly existed. She sat at the smallest table in the room. Humanity had been granted observer status, Tier 4, the lowest tier that existed, one rung above not invited at all. The reason was not subtle. Species were ranked by the Concord's Development Index, a formula weighing technology, unified governance, military capacity, and, this was the part that stung, demonstrated capacity for large-scale peaceful cooperation. Humanity's score on that last metric was, to put it politely, catastrophic. The Concord's own briefing document, leaked to Vasquez's aide before the session, used the word primitive 4 times in 2 paragraphs. They fight each other, the Ilkani delegate had said during the opening remarks, not even bothering to lower his translated voice. Over land. Over resources. Over ideas. Species like this do not mediate wars. Species like this cause them. Laughter. Not unkind, exactly, the amused, indulgent laughter of adults watching a child claim it could fix the family car. Vasquez didn't laugh. She wrote something down on the small notepad she'd insisted on bringing, despite every alien in the room having some form of neural or optical recording implant. What she wrote was, they've never had to negotiate with someone who could actually hurt them back. She was right. And it would matter more than anyone in that room could have guessed. The Drenico-Kani War was, by the numbers, the longest continuous conflict in the recorded history of the galaxy. 1,140 years. It had started over a mining dispute in a system neither side even controlled anymore, and it had calcified into something almost sacred, 2 civilizations that had built their entire identities around fighting each other. Generations had been born, lived, and died knowing nothing else. Trillions of credits and millions of lives had gone into a stalemate so perfectly balanced that neither side could win and neither side could afford to stop. The Concord had tried everything. Sanctions. Mediation. 300 years ago, a joint peacekeeping force from 11 species had tried to physically separate the 2 fleets and lost 4,000 peacekeepers in a single afternoon when both sides, briefly, agreed on something, shooting through the peacekeepers to get to each other. So when the newest, smallest, most primitive species in the Concord asked, quietly through official channels, using exactly the correct procedural forms, for permission to open, informal, non-binding communication channels, with both combatant governments, the response from the council was essentially a shrug. Let them try, said the Ilkani representative. It will teach them their place. Permission granted. Nobody expected anything to come of it. Nobody was watching very closely. That was the first mistake. Here is what the galaxy did not know about humanity, because the galaxy had only ever measured what humans fought over, never what humans had learned from fighting. Humanity had fought 2 world wars, dozens of proxy wars, a Cold War that lasted nearly half a century, and hundreds of smaller conflicts, and out of the wreckage of all of it they had built something the Concord species had never needed to build. An entire body of knowledge refined over centuries about how conflicts actually end. Not how they're won. How they end. The Concord species had never needed this. Most of them were single culture, single government worlds by the time they reached the stars, or they'd resolved their internal conflicts so long ago that the knowledge had calcified into philosophy, disconnected from anything practical. War, to them, was something you did to an enemy. It had never occurred to most Concord diplomats that war was also a system, with incentives, feedback loops, and exploitable structural weaknesses, the same as any other complex system. Humans had spent the 20th and 21st centuries learning to read those systems because they had to. Game theory. Conflict de-escalation psychology. Sanctions design. Ceasefire architecture. Track to diplomacy. Truth and reconciliation frameworks. Mutually assured destruction. And more importantly, mutually assured survival, the delicate art of making sure both sides had a face-saving door out of a fight neither could afford to lose in front of their own people. Elena Vasquez didn't have a battle fleet. She had a research team of 11 analysts back on Earth, full access to 800 years of human conflict resolution literature, and something the Concord had never once offered either warring empire in 11 centuries. Someone willing to actually listen to both sides separately without an agenda, and figure out what each of them was really afraid of losing. Her team spent 4 months doing something almost embarrassingly simple. They read everything. Every public statement either empire's leadership had made in the last 50 years. Every internal memo the Concord's open record laws had ever forced into the archive. Every casualty report, budget request, and propaganda broadcast. And they found it. The thing that 11 centuries of Concord mediators, all vastly more powerful, vastly more advanced, had somehow never bothered to look for. Neither empire actually wanted to keep fighting. They couldn't stop. The Drenic Compact's entire economy had been restructured, over 11 centuries, around wartime production. 40% of their population worked in industries that existed only because of the war. Their political system had evolved so that military leadership held effective veto power over civilian government, a structure that had calcified so deep into their culture that most Drenic citizens under the age of 200 couldn't conceive of what peace would even look like. Their children learned military discipline before they learned to read. If the war ended tomorrow, the Drenic Compact would face something far more terrifying to its leadership than continued war. Total economic collapse and a political vacuum that could topple the government within a single generation. The Ilkani Dominion had the mirror problem. Their entire cultural mythology, their religious structure, their concept of national honor, all of it had been built, generation by generation, around the idea of the eternal struggle against the Drenic. Ilkani religious texts written 8 centuries ago described the war as a divine test that would only end when one side proved itself worthy of victory. An Ilkani leader who negotiated peace wasn't just making a policy decision. They were committing something close to heresy. The last 3 Ilkani leaders who'd even suggested formal peace talks had been removed from power within the year, 2 of them violently. Both empires were trapped. Not by each other. By themselves. They kept fighting not because they wanted to win, but because stopping was more dangerous to each government than continuing, and neither side had ever had a third party willing to look past the battle lines and diagnose the actual disease. The Concord's mediators, for 1100 years, had kept asking the same question. What will make you stop fighting each other? It was the wrong question. It had always been the wrong question. Vasquez's team asked a different one. What does each of you need to be able to survive stopping? The plan that Elena Vasquez presented to the UN Interstellar Council, and after a great deal of very quiet, very careful diplomacy, to select military and intelligence liaisons from 4 Concord allied species, was not a peace treaty. It was a hostage extraction, and the hostages were 2 entire civilizations, trapped by their own internal politics. Humanity did not have a battle fleet capable of threatening either empire. What humanity had was something far rarer in Concord space: complete diplomatic invisibility. Neither empire took the human observers seriously enough to watch them. Vasquez's team had spent 4 months conducting quiet, separate, parallel back-channel conversations with reform factions inside both governments, factions that had existed for decades, powerless and afraid in both empires. People within the Drenic military-industrial establishment who'd spent their careers building weapons and hated it. Ilkani clergy who privately doubted the eternal struggle doctrine but had no safe way to say so. Humanity gave them one thing no Concord power ever had: cover. At 0300 hours Concord Standard, coordinated across both empires simultaneously, human-designed software, quietly installed over the preceding weeks through cooperating engineers inside both militaries, engineers who had been convinced not by threats or bribes but by 4 months of patient, honest conversation about their own children's futures, enacted a synchronized, completely non-destructive shutdown of both battle fleets' weapons and propulsion systems. Life support, communications, and crew safety systems were untouched. It wasn't sabotage. It was a pause button, built with the consent of people already embedded on both sides who wanted, more than anything, a reason their own governments could survive using to stop. And then the message appeared. Not a threat. Not a demand. An offer. Your fleets are safe. No one has been harmed. We have been speaking, separately, with representatives of both your governments for 4 months. We believe we understand what each of you is actually afraid of. We would like both of your leaderships to speak to us, together for the first time, in the next 6 hours before your fleets come back online. What happens after that conversation is entirely your choice. But we think you'll find you agree on more than you've been told. It wasn't domination. It was an intervention, the oldest human trick in the book, dressed in starlight. You don't threaten someone out of an addiction. You take away the thing propping up the lie they've been telling themselves, just long enough to make them look at what's actually underneath it, and you make sure someone they trust is standing next to them when they do. What followed, over the next 5 hours, was not a negotiation between two-star empires. It was closer to family therapy at the end of a barrel of a gun that had just, for the first time in 11 centuries, been quietly and gently set down. Vasquez didn't offer either side victory. She offered the Dreenic leadership a face-saving transition plan for their economy, drafted using 400 years of human post-war industrial conversion case studies, that let their leadership claim credit for a bold new economic era rather than admit defeat. She offered the Ilkani clergy a theological reframe, not written by humans but surfaced from within Ilkani scripture itself by Ilkani reformers who had wanted to say it for decades and never had the political cover, that recast the eternal struggle not as war against the Dreenic, but as the struggle to build a dominion worthy of the stars, a struggle that could now, finally, be won. By dawn both fleets were still dark. But both governments had, for the first time in 1100 years, said the same sentence to each other in the same room. We don't actually know how to stop. Help us stop. The Concord Council convened an emergency session 6 days later. Ambassador Threlkos and General Vavres, former enemies, now co-signatories to the first Dreenic-Ilkani ceasefire framework in 11 centuries, sat for the first time in the Concord's history at the same table. Elena Vasquez was asked formally to explain how a Tier 4 observer species with no battle fleet, no galactic standing, and a development index score the Concord itself had called embarrassing, had accomplished in 4 months what the combined diplomatic weight of the entire Concord had failed to accomplish in 1100 years. She didn't gloat. Humans who'd earned the right to gloat, she'd learned long ago, rarely needed to. You measured us by the wrong number, she said. You have a formula for peaceful cooperation and you scored us low on it because you counted every war we've ever fought. But you never asked what we learned from them. You've been lucky enough, some of you, to never need to learn how to stop fighting. We didn't have that luxury. We had to learn. Badly, slowly, at a terrible cost, but we learned it. And it turns out that's a technology too. It's just not one you can put a gun on. The chamber was silent again. A different kind of silence this time. Somewhere in the back, a young Ilkani attaché, one of the clergy Vasquez's team had spoken with, now newly appointed to a Dominion Peace Commission that hadn't existed a week earlier, was quietly crying in the specific way people cry when a weight they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it was there finally, sets itself down. Humanity's Development Index score was recalculated within the month. The Concord added a new metric to the formula, one that had never existed before, proposed unanimously and without debate. They called it, in the clumsy translation of Concord bureaucratic language, demonstrated capacity to end what others cannot. Earth held the highest score on the entire chart. No one called humans primitive again. Years later, when new species were inducted into the Concord and given their obligatory orientation briefing, one line was added to the standard welcome packet, just above the seating chart for the Grand Chamber. Do not assume a species with fewer ships has less power. Ask them, instead, what they had to learn to survive themselves. It may be the only weapon in the galaxy that ends wars instead of starting them. Elena Vasquez retired 11 years later on Earth, in a small house near the sea. She kept, on her desk until the day she died, the notepad from that first Concord session. The one where she'd written while an alien delegate laughed at her species. They've never had to negotiate with someone who could actually hurt them back. Underneath it, added years later in the same handwriting, was one more line. Turns out that wasn't the point. The point was we'd already learned how to stop. Peace, it turns out, has enemies. Not abstract ones. Specific, wealthy, well-armed ones. 3 weeks after the ceasefire framework was signed, a Dreenic industrialist named Corvith Ansay, whose family had built starship hulls for the compact military for 11 generations, whose entire fortune, estimated at some 4 trillion credits, existed because the war existed, sat in a private office on a moon nobody officially administered, and made a call he'd been putting off for exactly 19 days. The human woman, he said, needs to disappear. Quietly. Before the second round of talks. The being on the other end of the call was not Dreenic. It was not Ilkeni either. It didn't officially exist at all, according to any Concord registry, a fact that had made it extremely useful to people like Corvith Ansay for a very long time. That will cost more than your usual arrangements, the voice said. The humans have started noticing patterns. I don't care what it costs. If this peace holds, I lose everything. My children lose everything. There are 11 great shipbuilding families on Drain who feel exactly the way I do, and 40,000 mid-tier arms contractors under us who'll riot in the streets within a year once the military budget dies. You think Threlkos doesn't know this? He's just decided he'd rather be remembered as a peacemaker than protect the people who put him in office. Pause. And the Ilkeni side? Corvith allowed himself something close to a smile. The Ilkeni side is easier. You don't have to convince a fanatic to fight. You just have to remind him what he's supposed to believe. 400 light-years away, Elena Vasquez was drinking bad Concord issue coffee in a temporary office on Aveth 9, reviewing transit manifests with her intelligence liaison, a sharp, quiet young analyst named Priya Akonkochan, when Priya set down her tablet and said the sentence that would define the next 6 months of both their lives. Ma'am. I think someone's trying to restart the war. Priya's team had found it almost by accident, the kind of accident that only happens after you've trained yourself for months to look at every piece of data twice. Arms shipments. Small ones. Untraceable ones. Not from the Dreenic Compact's official military-industrial complex, and not from any registered Ilkeni supplier either. Someone was quietly rearming both militaries' hardline factions in parallel, using shell companies routed through 11 different jurisdictions, funded by an account structure so deliberately confusing it could only have been built by someone with centuries of practice. This isn't new, Priya said, pulling up a financial model that made Vasquez's stomach drop. Look at the funding pattern. It goes back 900 years. Every single time the war has nearly stalled, every ceasefire attempt in the historical record, all 41 of them, funding to hardline factions on both sides spikes in the preceding month. Someone has been keeping this war on life support for 9 centuries. Who benefits from a war that never ends? Priya pulled up one more file. A Concord shipping registry, buried 9 layers deep, tracing back to a trading conglomerate that didn't officially belong to any Concord member species at all. The Caliph Ascendancy, she said. They're not signatories to the Concord Charter. They don't have a council seat. Officially they're neutral traders, arms, medical supplies, ship parts, information brokerage. Officially they don't take sides in anything. And unofficially? Unofficially, I think they've been selling weapons to both the Dreenic and the Ilkeni for 900 years at war prices, and the day this war ends, their entire economy craters. We're not looking at an arms dealer who profits from war, Elena. We're looking at a civilization that built itself on this specific war never ending. To them, what we did that first night wasn't diplomacy. It was an act of economic warfare against a third party nobody in the Concord even knew was playing the game. Vasquez sat back slowly. 1100 years. 41 failed ceasefires. It had never been 2 civilizations too stubborn to stop. It had been 2 civilizations with a dealer standing quietly in the shadows, making sure they never got clean. Well, she said after a long moment in the same flat, dangerous calm she'd once used across a table from men holding actual guns to actual hostages. That explains why every peace attempt in 11 centuries failed the moment it started working. Here is the second thing the Concord had never bothered to learn about humanity because they'd never needed to. Humans do not respond to a threat against something they've built by escalating. They respond by getting quiet. Vasquez did not go to the Concord Council. Going public would tip off Caliph operatives already embedded inside both governments, and 9 centuries of practice meant those operatives were good. Instead, she did something the Caliph ascendancy, in 900 years of expert manipulation, had never once accounted for, because no species they'd ever encountered had thought to do it. She told the truth to the two people the ascendancy needed to keep in the dark the most. Threlkos and General Vavres were brought, separately, into a small secure room on Aveth 9, and shown Priya's financial model in full. 9 centuries of funding data. 41 failed ceasefires, each one preceded by the exact same spike in arms flow to the exact same category of hardline faction. The pattern was so old, so consistent, so mathematically undeniable that neither leader needed to be convinced. They needed, instead, about 90 seconds each to feel something far more useful to Vasquez's purposes than surprise. Rage. Not at each other. For the first time in either of their careers, not at each other. 900 years, Vavres said very quietly, staring at the display. My grandfather died in the Corvai offensive. My father lost his arm at Threll's Gate. I have buried friends by the thousands, believing every one of those deaths meant something, believing this war was a struggle between two peoples who simply could not agree. His hands, human researchers would later note, had begun to shake. A physiological stress response Ilkani biology shared, it turned out, almost exactly with humans. You're telling me someone has been selling us the bullets on both sides the entire time? I'm telling you, Vasquez said, that the war you inherited was never really yours to end or continue. It was a product. And you were the customers. Threlkos, in his own room 40 minutes later, asked only one question. What do you need from us? It was, Vasquez would say later, the exact moment 1100 years of Caliph prophet began to collapse. Not because humanity had exposed them, but because humanity had understood something the ascendancy's 9 centuries of manipulation had never accounted for. Two enemies who discover they've both been played by the same third party don't go back to hating each other. They go looking for the dealer. Together. What followed was not a battle. Humanity still had no fleet worth the name, and the Caliph ascendancy, whatever else it was, controlled enough quiet, deniable military assets to make direct confrontation suicidal. So Vasquez's team did the one thing 1100 years of Concord military strategists had never thought to try against an enemy that operated entirely through shadow and denial. They built a trap out of paperwork. Working with reform factions now empowered in both governments, the same clergy, the same disillusioned industrial engineers who'd helped shut down the fleet 6 months earlier, now with actual institutional power behind them for the first time in their lives, Vasquez's team helped draft a joint Drina-Kilkenny reconstruction accord. A real one. Full economic transition plans, full demilitarization schedule, full amnesty framework. Made entirely public, filed with the Concord Council in the most bureaucratically boring, unremarkable way imaginable. Buried in an appendix, item 43 of 61, third-party arms trade review historical. It was a small provision. A routine audit clause. It required, as a condition of Concord-recognized peace, a full historical review of all arms transactions to either military over the past millennium, cross-referenced against Concord trade registries, with results to be published openly. To anyone else it would have looked like bureaucratic housekeeping. To the Caliph ascendancy, it looked like a 900-year money trail about to be handed to the entire galaxy. They panicked. And panicking people, panicking civilizations, make the one mistake 9 centuries of careful, patient manipulation had always let them avoid. They acted fast. 3 days before the Accord's ratification vote, Caliph operatives attempted to assassinate both Threlkos and Vavres simultaneously, in a strike designed to look like each side had attacked the other. The same trick, Priya's analysis would later confirm, they'd used successfully 11 times over 9 centuries to collapse exactly this kind of peace process before it could finish. It failed. Not because of human weapons. Because, for the first time in 900 years, Drinic and Ilkani security forces were sharing real-time intelligence with each other, and with Earth, instead of watching each other for the next attack. The assassins were captured alive on both worlds within the hour. And unlike every previous close call in 11 centuries, this time the people questioning them weren't trying to prove the other side had done it. They were trying to prove neither side had. The Caliph ascendancy's formal accounting, every transaction, every shell company, every arms sale, every funded hardline faction, 900 years of it, was presented to the full Concord Council 4 months later. Not by a human. Vasquez had insisted on that. It was presented jointly by Threlkos and Vavres, standing at the same podium, reading from the same document, to a chamber so silent that the recording of it would later be studied in diplomatic academies across a dozen species for the next century. The Caliph ascendancy did not have a council seat to lose. It had something worse. It had, for 9 centuries, operated on the unspoken assumption that no two of its customers would ever compare notes. That assumption, once broken, broke everything. Within a year, 17 other Concord conflicts, smaller wars, quieter ones nobody had ever bothered to ask why they never seemed to end, were opened for the same review. 9 of them turned up the same pattern. Different arms brokers. Same design. Humanity did not destroy the Caliph ascendancy. That was never the goal, and Vasquez was blunt about why in her closing statement to the council. We are not interested in replacing one kind of primitive violence with another. We're interested in taking away the profit motive for a lie that costs people their children. Economic sanctions, full trade transparency requirements, and, at the insistence of the Dreenic and Ilkani delegations themselves, not humanity's, full reparations to both empires, structured over 2 centuries, did the rest. It was Vavres, oddly, who said the thing that ended up carved, eventually, into the base of the new Concord Peace Memorial on Aveth 9. We spent 1100 years being told our enemy was each other. It took a species with no fleet, no seat, and 40 years of spaceflight to teach us the actual enemy was whoever profited from us never finding out. 5 years after that first silent night, the Concord Council created a new institution, unprecedented in its charter, funded jointly by every member species and, over loud initial objection from several of the galaxy's oldest and proudest civilizations, headquartered not on a neutral station but on Earth. The Concord Mediation Corps. Its founding director was Elena Vasquez, 56 years old, no longer the ambassador of a Tier 4 observer species, but the head of the single most requested diplomatic body in galactic history. Its founding doctrine, translated into 41 languages and posted at the entrance of every Corps office across Concord space, was 11 words long. Ask what they're afraid to lose, not what they want to win. Humanity was still, by any measure the Concord had used a decade earlier, the youngest, smallest, most technologically modest civilization in the Concord. Its ships were still slower. Its fleets were still smaller. On paper, by every old metric, humans remained exactly what the Ilkani delegate had called them that first day in the Grand Chamber. Primitive. But somewhere in the years since, the word had quietly stopped meaning what it used to mean. Species across the Concord had begun sending their diplomats to Earth not to negotiate with humanity, but to study under it, to learn, in classrooms built in the same UN buildings that had once trained hostage negotiators and ceasefire monitors for a species too small to matter, the specific, hard-won, blood-soaked human art of ending what other people had convinced themselves could never end. Priya Akonkochan, 31 years old, was appointed the Corps' first deputy director. On her desk, she kept a copy of the same notepad line Vasquez had written on her own desk years before, copied out in her own handwriting, because Vasquez had given it to her on her first day with a simple instruction. Remember this or none of it means anything. They've never had to negotiate with someone who could actually hurt them back. Turns out that wasn't the point. The point was we'd already learned how to stop. Underneath it, in Priya's handwriting, one more line had been added. The line that would open the Corps' training manual for the next generation of human diplomats, sent out to a galaxy that had once laughed them out of a chamber and now, quietly, respectfully, kept a seat for them at every table that mattered. Somebody has to go first. It might as well be us.